So the excavations on Traprain Law in the southeast of Scotland produced this amazing hoard, which was, as I say, the biggest and the best, most spectacular of these Hacksilver hoards from anywhere in the Roman world. And just to recap, the star marks where the excavations took place. Edinburgh sits here, so we're in the southeast of Scotland, and the hill that you see in the picture bottom left is where the excavations took place. The fine spot is over here. Are you now seeing a different slide?
That's perfect, yes.
Excellent, good. So the hoard was published by Alexander Curll in 1923, but we were keen to re-examine it. And in a project run with Kenneth Painter and Anne-Marie Kaufmann-Heinemann, we wanted to re-examine the hoard in the context of recent work. This is partly because there's been so many recent discoveries of late Roman silver, but also because perceptions have changed. Curll's focus was very much on the original form of the vessels themselves, whereas our interest really is much more of a life cycle approach, from the production of the objects through the use as vessels, their use as Hacksilver, their burial, and then their discovery and their afterlife in the 20th and 21st centuries. Now today I'm going to focus mostly on the Hacksilver part of the story, but I'll touch briefly on the production and the use just to give you a sense of the original contents of this hoard. I won't go into the production in great detail, but we have obviously got a whole range of facilities that weren't available in the 1920s, from X-radiography to various forms of analysis and microscopic examination. And just to take one example here, this was the first vessel that was discovered from the hoard. It was actually found by the foreman while he was, if I quote the phrase exactly, loosening the ground gently with his pick. And he put the pick through the side of this vessel and pulled up the silver bowl. You can see the hole made by the pick, but more importantly, you can see the variations in density running around the object, which shows where it's been hammered as it's been spun as a way of forming it. And you can also see the hollowness of the rim. So the technology is one aspect we can say a lot more about. One of the things which has long been a question of debate, and which we still struggle to answer though, is the origins of this material. Where were these objects made? Curll felt most of it was Mediterranean, possibly Eastern Empire. He talked a lot of Alexandrian sources. But in fact, all these things are based on style judgments. It's very hard to pinpoint where something comes from because patterns are so widely shared across the Roman Empire. So for example, these bowls here, I could quote you parallels from England, I could quote you parallels from Germany, I can quote you parallels from Syria and North Africa. So the style really doesn't help to see where it comes from. What will eventually help is scientific analysis. Now, we were reluctant to try looking at lead isotope analysis of the silver. The silver, of course, is all extracted from lead ores, and traces of that lead survives into the silver coin. And I was into the silver object, and I was a little bit skeptical because I was concerned about the impact of recycling on this material. So instead, we sampled the solder, which you can see bottom left, the glue on the back of some of the pieces. Because solder is not going to be traded and not going to be recycled. It's generally locally available. So this would give us a clue as to where the objects were assembled. It's only a handful of things in the hoard, but the results are quite striking because they don't match any of the Mediterranean sources. They don't match the Spanish or the Greek sources or the Balkan sources. They fit instead into Rhineland and central England, northern Pennine sources. So it suggests the source of the lead for the solder is northwest provinces. And it raises the possibility that much of this material might actually be assembled, possibly made, as in a provincial context. Now, since we did this work, there's been some really exciting analysis using lead isotopes on a range of other silver hoards. And I think what that's shown is that my concerns were unfounded. There's much less recycling of this material than people thought. So, for example, the Trier hoard, the data from that is coming back as German. The Sevso treasure from Hungary is showing use of Balkan silver and so on. So when we can raise some more funding, our next step will be to analyse the isotopes in a whole spectrum of the Traprain material, because the very nature of its accumulation means that we'll be able to get a snapshot of circulating silver in the northwestern provinces, not just the material from a single dinner service. I say dinner service because that's the main use of this material in the late antique world. This wonderful mosaic from the Villa Cadedi in Sicily, showing a fancy picnic taking place in the great outdoors, gives you an idea of how this material would have been used. From the servant or enslaved person on the left pouring wine and water into a glass goblet. In the centre, the poor little poultry resting on its bead-rimmed dish. And on the right, the person washing their hands in a basin with water being poured from a silver jug. It gives an idea of the range of ways that silver is being used at the late antique table, and we have fragments of all these kinds of objects from the hoard. Now, if I was talking more about the original uses of this material, I would talk a lot more about the individual vessel types that we're seeing, but I'll restrict myself just to one example. This is a curious piece which Carl identified as something very strange and reconstructed as a heart-shaped vessel with a fish on it. But there were no parallels for this until 2006, when the hoard of Vinkovci in Croatia, dating to the middle of the 4th century, produced exactly such a vessel. You can see how the curve of our vessel fits there, and when this was cleaned up, you could see traces of fish engraved on the surface. And it is most likely a vessel for serving fish at the dinner. The other main context is female self-representation and female beauty. A lot of silver is being used for bathing and personal adornment. And again, this mosaic from Sidi Grib, you can see the mirror with the domina of the household checking her hairdo. You can see the silver caskets for clothing and for bathing as well. And once again, we have material of this style from the hoard. Here, this glorious fluted vessel, which in the centre of it shows a nereid, a sea nymph, riding a sea panther. Exactly the kind of aquatic theme that would be appropriate for something used at the toilet. Other components are much smaller. There are a very few pieces of belt fittings and other items of personal adornment, some of these military in origin, the belts are primarily a military thing, and there's literally a handful of coins, which I will tantalise you with a mention of now and come back later on to show you. But these images are slightly misleading. The hoard wasn't complete, it was fragmentary. It went into the ground in pieces. And when it was excavated, the excavator, I think, couldn't really believe what had happened to it. So he saw this immediately as the work of pirates, the work of robbers. He saw it very much as an act of barbarians, because surely only barbarians could destroy late Roman silver in this way. You can hear the horror in his voice in his diary entries. And it was part of this general view that really blamed barbarians for everything going wrong in the late Roman world. So the interpretation very much was the barbarians plunder Britain or Gaul and bring their loot back to their pirates' lair where it's chopped to pieces. This has always seemed slightly odd to me for a number of reasons, one of which is, as we'll see later, that Traprain Law was a place on good terms with the Roman world for a long period of time. But when we began to collate the wider evidence of Hacksilver, there were other sources of evidence that suggested this wasn't what was happening. This distribution, for example, you will see that Hacksilver, most common in the northwestern provinces, but common on both sides of the frontier. This is not just a barbarian habit. And as we began to look more carefully at the material itself, we realised some interesting patterns. One was the very way these things were cut up. They're cut up very carefully into halves or into quarters, or in the case of the Largitio vessel from Grossbodingen, into a half and then into sixths, and each sixth then carefully subdivided. If this is the work of barbarians, they are obsessive compulsive barbarians. Somebody is being very careful, very methodical in the way this material is being chopped up. And the answer, of course, is weight. Many late Roman vessels are made from set weights of silver. The bowl bottom left, for example, weighs a pound. If you chop a bowl that weighs a pound into 4 quarters, of course, you have 4 handy lumps of bullion, each weighing a quarter of a pound. And what we're seeing here is the transformation in meaning and the transformation in value from objects valued primarily for their presentational importance and demonstration of wealth to transportable bullion, most likely at times of personal or wider crisis. And as one starts to work your way obsessively through the data on Hacksilver hoards, and I have been quite obsessive over this, you see the significance of weight again and again. On this hoard from Echt in the Netherlands, for example, the fragments of silver collectively weigh half a pound. Or the hoard from Water Newton in East Anglia, the two lumps bottom left and right weigh 1 and 2 pounds respectively. So we're seeing this shift of silver from presentational silver, if you like social silver, to bullion, to economic silver. And it's being done quite carefully. I realise my these things that I'd left in are kind of causing chaos in what you can actually see or not. So I hope you can still see the details of this. What this shows is within Hacksilver that we looked at, the accuracy to Roman weight standards is generally within 4 or 5%. And this compares very favourably to the accuracy, for example, of official ingots, which also which actually often have a poorer accuracy. They're often as much as 6 or 7% deviant from where they ought to be. So there is quite a lot of care being taken in the way that this Hacksilver is being weighed out. And it suggests an economic transformation, most likely within, not outside the Roman world. But this cutting is being done at times of economic crisis. If we then look at the chronology of this, we see interesting patterns. Most of the 2nd century finds come from Britain, which always does slightly odd things as silver. The 3rd century finds are overwhelmingly from the Gaulish and German provinces. And of course, the 3rd century is a time of particular problems in these areas. The 4th and 5th centuries, there's a focus particularly along the Rhine, in Britain and Ireland, and also in southern Scandinavia. And the 6th and 7th century, this becomes pretty much a Scandinavian habit, with a couple of examples from Eastern Europe. So there's a real shift in the pattern of Hacksilver through time, with a peak in the 4th and 5th centuries. And we can explore this further if we start to categorise the material. So the way I've tried to think about it is really in 3 groups, focusing on the Roman Hacksilver. And there are other ways to look at it that I can come to in discussion if you wish, but from a Hacksilver perspective, with a Hacksilver head-on, this is quite a useful way to think about it. So my category A is Roman hoards, which contain a little bit of Hacksilver. Category B are ones dominated by Roman Hacksilver. And category C are hoards that are full of Hacksilver, but only some of that is Roman. So they're really taking us into the early medieval period, where there's a lot of local silver being chopped up. And we'll look at the first 2 of those initially. Here, for example, the Group A hoards are entirely within the empire, dominated by Roman plate and coin, with a little bit of Hacksilver. And I give you the example here of the Xanten hoard to show that these things are interchangeable. You know, the hoard is published as the plate, the jewellery, and the coins. But when you add the weight of the plate and the coins together, it's exactly 5 pounds of silver. So these things are seen as interchangeable. It's not as if the fact that silver is in coin form or in plate form really makes a difference. So we have the plate, the coin, and in this case also the Hacksilver, the handle of a bucket there, and a component of an inkwell separated out. So the weights of these things are critical. And when we're looking at coin hoards, the weight of the coin hoard, I would say, is far more important, or as important, as the weight of the individual coins. We need to be thinking about the massive bullion that is being accumulated. The Group B hoards, the ones dominated by Hacksilver, are the ones that see this leap across the frontier. We see them both inside and outside the empire, particularly in the northwestern provinces. And this is the moment when we do see Hacksilver coming up in Barbaricum, but it is a second stage. That's why I don't think this is primarily a story about loot. It's a story about things being chopped up inside the empire initially, and then moving beyond it. The earliest examples are 3rd century, and they come from the furthest reaches of the empire, the left-hand one from Scotland, the right-hand one from Ukraine. So we're seeing this phenomenon happening widely but sparsely. And the question is why? because this becomes a dominant thing in the 4th and 5th centuries. Why is silver moving into barbarian hands? I say I don't think loot is a good general explanation, and the phenomena I would tend to look for are twofold. One is effectively diplomatic, the paying off of barbarians. And here we see a wonderful 16th century vision of what a Pict looked like. And the other is hiring soldiers. Silver and gold are the media in which you pay your troops in the late Roman world through donatives. And if you look at the Notitia Dignitatum and the material on the page of the Count of the Sacred Largesse, we see silver and gold in quantity as being the ways that troops are being paid. Well, in a world where getting access to struck coin or carefully made vessels becomes difficult, Hacksilver becomes a very feasible alternative. And we can see this in the great hoard from Kaiser August in Switzerland. This is really one of the poster boys of late antique dining. But the thing that caught my eye, and interestingly central stage in this photograph, is this tiny piece here. So within this hoard of great dinner service, there are two pieces of Hacksilver, a chopped down vessel and a chopped down ingot. The hoard dates to the rule of Magnentius, the usurper Magnentius, deposited in the early 350s. And Magnentius, as a usurper, struggled to get hold of silver to keep his troops loyal. And Martin Guggisberg has tracked the hoards of Magnentius in the Western Empire, looking at the irregular forms of silver. Now, many of them are coin hoards, but you also see irregular silver in that sense, ingots struck with the face of the emperor, Hacksilver, and so on and so forth. And it reflects the great need of a usurper to get loyalty from their troops. And if you can't strike coin, you don't have access to the official mint or the technology of that mint. If you can't easily strike coin or make vessels, taking existing silver as tax and effectively restriking it, recalibrating it, chopping it down, these are ways you can pay your soldiers. So one of the contexts for Hacksilver is clearly, I think, usurpers. We see it in Magnentius. We see it also in Constantine III, who rises in Britain. Britain seems to have something of a monopoly on usurpers in the late 4th and early 5th century. And he rises in Britain, moves to the continent, and you see again a whole string of these Hacksilver hoards, or hoards concluding Hacksilver, that end with coins of Constantine III. So when we look at this 4th and 5th century distribution, a remarkable number of these hoards can be connected to the activities of usurpers. So that, I think, is one of the processes that is leading to this creation of Hacksilver. And almost as an aside to this, one of the things the weight analysis of the material has shown, which is a complete surprise, is the recurring presence of 4-ounce units. So what we see when I began to collate the data, one of the things that we saw again and again, and you can see in the rank size plot, was material correlating to a 4-ounce step. And I feel that this is almost a standard unit of exchange within this Hacksilver world. So that gives you a wider context. Let's come back to the great hill of Traprain Law. What can we say about the setting of this hoard and the hoard itself? Well, Traprain was a dominant site in the Roman Iron Age. And if you look at the occupation of Roman Scotland, the Romans pop in and out of Scotland 3 times, trying but failing to conquer it, that you'll see the red squares of Roman military installations, and there are none of those in the area of East Lothian or indeed Fife. Areas, it seems, that were on friendly terms with the Roman world. Areas that we can see perhaps as client kingdoms. And this is reflected in the wealth of Roman objects coming off the site. There are more Roman finds from Traprain than from the rest of Iron Age Scotland put together. And this spans from the 1st century through to the early 5th. And when the Romans pull back to Hadrian's Wall for good in the 3rd century, they still need eyes and ears in the north. You don't just build a wall and forget what's happening beyond it. So Traprain, in that sense, remains as a friend of the Roman world because they are their eyes and ears against this emerging threat of the Picts to the north. The site is refortified at this time. A massive defensive wall is built, and the excavations that I've been involved in show that every inch of the hill is covered with settlement in the 4th and 5th centuries. It's an absolute frontier town, thriving with activity. And this includes some remarkable finds. This object here, fragment of a lovely glass vessel, the kind of thing which Jenny Price, the late Jenny Price, argued could easily be a diplomatic gift. It's such a rare item. Or these bronzes here, which come from late Roman military kit. The crossbow brooch and the strap ends and belt buckle indicate people who served for Rome, who raised their swords for Rome, were depositing the material in Traprain Law. People from Traprain were serving in the Roman army. Does this help us to understand the hoard? I would argue it does. And we've done a detailed study of this material, looking not only at the individual vessel categories, but what I was interested in was the Hacksilver itself. What can it tell us about the ways it's been chopped up, the tools, the weights, and so on? Let's start with the weight. So if we plot the weight of this material from lightest to heaviest as a rank size plot, we get one of these curves, and the curve has steps. And many of those steps correlate with Roman weight units. It shows, I think, that the primary cutting of much of this material is Roman. And in some cases, the two objects I show here, you see a very interesting particular pattern of packages of silver. So these come from the same vessel. Individually, they don't show a correlation with weight standards, but collectively they weigh exactly 8 ounces. So I think we can argue the initial chopping of this material, as we've seen elsewhere, is done in the Roman world. But you will rapidly see that there are curves in this graph where there are no steps, where there is no correlation to Roman standards. And this reflects, I think, the longevity of this material moving into another context. I spent far too long staring at pieces of silver, looking at the cut edges to see what they could tell us. And you can see a good example of that in this material here. Sorry, let me just kill that phone. The edge on the right has been carefully cut with shears. The one on the bottom, rather less carefully cut. The one on the left looks like it's been chewed by a mad dog. This is clearly being done by different people at different times. And we can argue different tools are being used in different phases. Let's look at this example here. 3 fragments of a Roman plate. Starting life as a half, then a quarter, and then being cut down again and again. Chopped there, the plain silver being cut, chopped down again. This has gone through multiple phases of hacking. So when we look at the evidence of this, the different phases of the materials being used, some come with very little hacking at all, the bowl at the bottom that has simply been folded. Some are chopped down to tiny fragments. They've been chopped again and again and again. What this indicates is a longevity to the silver in this hoard. This hasn't just come to Traprain directly from the Roman world. Much of it is circulated and used. And if you look at the production dates of these finds, the work that Stephanie Martin-Kilcher did, we can see in terms of production, there is material being made from around 300 up to around 450. This is a really unusual spectrum in any one hoard within the Roman Empire. It strongly suggests it's accumulating over a long period of time. In other words, it doesn't come to the hoard to the hill in one go. It's coming in multiple different stages. It is active silver and a whole series of different events. Finally, this takes us to coinage. I can hear a sigh of relief in the background. This is not really a coin hoard, it's fair to say. There are only 5 siliquae from the hoard, only 4 of which are worth photographing. But you will see immediately, these are not your common or garden siliquae. They are that peculiarly British habit of the clipped siliqua, which has been a point of debate among numismatists since the 1980s. But I think recently, with the work of Andrew Burnett, Peter Guest, Richard Abday, and so on, the idea that this represents the deliberate harvesting of silver for subsequent use, I think makes a lot more sense. It isn't in that sense fraudulent. It's a desire emerging in the early 5th century in Britain to try to extract more silver to use for things like ingots or perhaps for further siliqua copies to keep the economy going after the connections with the Roman world have been cut. It is, I guess, if you like, the equivalent of a Brexit reaction once you suddenly discover you no longer have access to this wonderful market on your doorstep. Because the clipping happens sequentially. It's clearly not trying to go to particular weight standards. It's the shaving away of the silver for reuse, but always leaving, critically, the face value, the face of the emperor, to guarantee that this was official coin of certain purity. And although there are scant examples on the continent, the strong distribution of this material is in Britain, and also mostly in the south and east, not in the frontier zone. So it shows the area that is trying to maintain a running economy in the early 5th century and gives us an idea of where some of the material from Traprain is coming from. But Hacksilver, even I will have to admit, is not the answer to everything. Why are there gaps in the distribution? Why is it only found in particular areas? Well, we need to consider different kinds of silver, and you'll be sighing that at last there are more coins appearing here. Silver, of course, can circulate in many different forms in the late antique world, as plate, as ingot, as hacksilver, as coinage, and also beyond the frontier as old denarii. So if we look, for example, at the distribution of these different kinds of vessels, we see they all differ. They're responding to different processes. Vessels are essentially a phenomenon of empire. They are circulating among the intra-provincial elite. They're signs of elite taste at the dining table and for female beauty, and they're circulating across this area that the late Roman elites are still moving within. Beyond the frontier, incredibly rare in the west, rather more common in the east, mostly in rich burials where they probably crop up as diplomatic gifts. Ingots are very much a frontier phenomenon in the Rhine and the Danube, and then on what's called the Saxon shore in Britain, the area in the southeast where there's intense military activity in the late 4th and early 5th century. They only rarely get beyond the frontier. It's not the normal way for silver to move across the frontier. Silica hoards have a very partial distribution, and here I'm drawing on the coin hoards of the Roman Empire project with some additions. It's mostly a British phenomenon. There's a cluster in eastern Romania and Moldavia in Barbaricum, but within the empire they're really rather sparse. Although siliquae are circulating, the hoarding of siliquae is a peculiar habit in particular areas of Britain and of Eastern Europe. And the Romanian Moldavian examples are argued to be subsidies of the 360s. In Britain, it's almost all material being deposited right at the end of the Roman world. Deposited, I would argue, as bullion rather than as coinage. But there is another source of silver in Barbaricum, and that's denarii. While within the empire, the denarius has long vanished from circulation by this time, beyond the frontier, it's clear that the denarii that left the empire in the late 2nd and early 3rd century are still in circulation. The work of Alexander Burscher and colleagues has got repeated instances of denarii in associations that point to 4th and 5th century dates. And it's almost the reflex, the complement of the distribution of silver beyond the frontier. If we try to put all this together, we see that within the empire, vessels are representing elite identity, ingots being used mostly for military pay. Beyond the frontier, the story is not just silver, of course, but also gold. And in the continental empires, the solidus is one of the ways you pay off barbarians. In Britain, Ireland, and Denmark, you also see hacksilver, but in most of the continent, it's denarii that are acting as the means, the medium of silver that still survives, and surviving in such a way that copies are being made locally, and die links between these copies connect all across Europe, leading back into Ukraine, where much of this material, it seems, is being struck. So we're seeing connections across Germanic elites at this time, and clearly a need for these small silver ingots or small silver tokens within Germanic society. So beyond the frontier, we see very different silver worlds. In Britain and Ireland, hacksilver is what you're using. In most of continental Barbaricum, it's denarii that are your silver source. And it's really only in Denmark, northern Germany, and northwestern Poland that you see the two coexisting. Even here, they are very rarely buried together. They seem to have different social roles. And in Britain and Ireland, it is silver, not gold. My continental colleagues always say that our barbarians simply weren't threatening enough to merit gold. But I think there's a deliberate choice taking place here. Late Roman gold is coming into Scotland and Ireland. Here, for example, a whole range of Scottish finds that are best seen as diplomatic gifts or imperial gifts. But they're not significant in the way that silver is significant. There's no continuing reuse of this material because in that sense, gold is familiar. Scotland is a country rich in gold. There's been a tradition of gold use for 2,000 years by this period. Silver is new. And not only that, much of the silver carries the stamp of empire. It shows evidence you have these connections to the Roman world. So I think there's a value to silver beyond that of gold. Values of metals are cultural, not absolute. And I think in our frontier world in Scotland and in Ireland, silver is more important than gold. Important, of course, is the raw material. And here we're back to Traprain. We see the material being chopped up, turned into packages, thrown into crucibles, and remelted into local status symbols. Most of these are small-scale things. We see finger rings and ear rings and hand pins, the length and breadth of the country that are used, I think, to mark your access to this raw material. And you can imagine the eye-catching quality of silver. It really is something you focus on when you see it. But there is also dramatic use of silver, conspicuous consumption of this material in these enormous silver neck chains. The biggest of these using almost 2 kilograms of silver. And they focus very much immediately north of the frontier zone and in the area in the northeast where the Picts are emerging. So we're seeing Roman silver transformed into local status goods, and silver becomes the status material of choice in the years to come. That's why we see my final category of Hacksilver hoards, a local material with a little bit of Roman, particularly in Britain and in Denmark, showing the way that these silver cycles continue to run. So I'm sorry there weren't many coins in it, but nonetheless, I hope that this has been a useful story to look at the ways in which silver in many different forms is informing us about the late antique world. I think Hacksilver in particular can tell us about the economic crisis, the way that people are adapting to that in the 3rd and 4th centuries, but also the way that silver is used in dealing with the worlds beyond, in diplomacy, in military pay, as usurpers try to find a way of keeping their troops loyal. And then the impact of that in local society, how silver becomes the way that you want to, the material you want to use in the centuries after that. So long after Rome as a military threat has left this area, the legacy of Roman silver lasts long afterwards. Thank you very much.